The first Resident Evil was undeniably a popular game, but I think it would be fair to say that it's Capcom's 1998 sequel that has really put the series on the map in terms of sales and public reception. Which is ironic, because Resident Evil 2 is not survival horror. It's an action game with horror aesthetics that just happens to reuse and update mechanics from its more survival-focused predecessor. While the series is often blamed for losing its survival horror roots and focusing more and more on action, the point of contention usually begins with Resident Evil 4, a title that has openly changed its camera perspective and gameplay style, becoming more of a survival thriller than survival horror. Meanwhile, Resident Evil 2 sits there on the side, not being even a survival thriller but just an action game, a really freaking good one though, successfully avoiding ire by posing itself as a horror title. But so we'd all be on the same page, let's define what horror and survival mean in the context of this discussion. There are many types of horror, but at its core each one is still about power imbalance. The scales are not on your side, to the point that you outright might feel powerless. Survival, on the other hand, is the aspect of resource conservation and strategizing. You can't succeed if you just willy-nilly use everything up to deal with a situation. The first Resident Evil game technically has enough weapons and ammo lying around so you could kill everyone. But it's spread out irregularly enough, especially if you're playing as Chris, that if you don't conserve your resources, you'll find yourself in a powerless situation. Yes, by the end it can transform into an outright action game, but that's a reward for proper resource management. By succeeding in the strategizing and survival aspect, you get rid of the horror and shift the power balance to your side. That's just the nature of combining the two principles together. It can be avoided, but that would require changing the supporting pillars. Resident Evil 2, on the other hand, showers you with resources from the get-go. It does increase the number of enemies per room from the average of 1-2 to an average of 3-4, and I have to admit that blowing up the heads of several zombies with a single shotgun round is satisfying. That said, with a couple of very specific exceptions, it gives you the tools to deal with absolutely every challenge before you encounter it, meaning you don't have to make any strategic decisions. In the first Resident Evil game, every time you entered a room with an enemy, particularly in the beginning of your first playthrough, you had to ask yourself a question: do you kill or avoid them? There is no such dilemma in Resident Evil 2. You kill them, that's the only right answer, as you don't ever have to be afraid about running out of resources at all, unless you decide to just not explore or interact with anything on your way to the next objective. But on your first playthrough, why would you? You still need to find key items anyway. To be quite honest, I would even question if Resident Evil 2 can be considered a Resident Evil game in the first place. Brand identity is a complicated topic, especially when it concerns sequels that popularize a franchise while significantly shifting its principles. After all, brand identity is also subjective per player. The first game of a series that a person is going to experience and enjoy is what's going to define the IP for them. And Resident Evil 2 did just that for many. Which means that even if they would go and play the first Resident Evil, they'd look at it through the prism of the sequel. Never mind that if Resident Evil 1 would ever have a hallway with 6 zombies close to the beginning of the game, trying to kill them all would lead to a situation where you'd only get rid of 3 if you're lucky, and then will just remain without ammo for the foreseeable nearby future. While Resident Evil 2 is so generous with giving resources in advance that not only you can get rid of everyone, you will have enough left for one other crowd before the game throws in more ammo at you. There won't be any point further on when you might think, maybe I shouldn't have spent all those handgun bullets on those 6 zombies. So one can't even say if resource management exists as a pillar. At most, it transforms into item management, because you still have limited inventory space and a bunch of key items to worry about. But even that loses its relevance throughout the campaign. This fully changes the relationship that pillar had with the puzzle box one, especially with how that aspect was streamlined in the first place. Now it exists to propel you forward through various action and narrative scenarios, rather than have you figure out how to best manage the space and enemies within it, while going back and forth bringing items from one place to another. You might say that the pillar of tension is still present, but only insofar as any action and new enemy encounters create the feeling of tension, not the specific interplay between resource management and puzzles that would constantly challenge you on how risky or risk-averse you want to be. The only pillar that actually remains fully consistent with the previous title is that of knowledge. And that's because Resident Evil 2 doubles down on the replayability factor in many ways, but it's something that would be worthy of a separate, focused discussion. Still, all this would be enough for me to claim that Resident Evil 2 is a sequel that absolutely forgoes its brand identity, if not for two particular aspects that really blur the lines of identity limits. The first, of course, is the fact that Resident Evil 2 is based on the same engine and mechanics as its predecessor. While the gameplay style is not something unique to Resident Evil, it is definitely associated with it, and we can't just ignore that. Further on, while Resident Evil 2 is an action game that uses outright diametrically opposite to Resident Evil 1 underlying design principles, it wants to create the same kinds of feelings and emotions as the first game, just in a more fast-paced, more guided way. So, let's see how Resident Evil 2 tackles just that. Resident Evil 2 is all about setting up and keeping momentum. This doesn't mean non-stop action, mind you, but the player must always have a feeling of progressing and moving forward. Of course, this is pushed to the extreme the very first moment the gameplay starts. You are put in a situation where you're surrounded by zombies and have to find your way towards the police station, the mansion of this game, so to speak. It should be noted that ironically this is the only segment where you will really feel the lack of ammo, as you start with practically nothing and have to gather more on the way, creating that sensation of being overwhelmed with not enough resources, even though shortly after that's going to stop being the case. And while after the environments change from very linear and fast-paced to more open and exploratory, the principles don't become any less guided. Resident Evil 1 would push you indeed towards certain sections of the map in the beginning, particularly in Jill's campaign, to make sure you manage to wrap your head around the game's concepts if it's your first time playing. But there was also quite a lot of freedom. You could get several keys and crests from the get-go, depending on how you decide to explore the mansion. There's no such thing when you get to experience the police station your first time around. Technically, after you go through all the necessary cutscene introductions, both the left and right wings are available to you just like in the first game. In practice, you can't really do anything in the right half of the building to progress, except getting the map for the station, but even then, the password for the safe it's in is on the left side. And though after you get the map you will also see what doors are unlocked by which keys, a very helpful quality of life feature added to the sequel, the necessity of that is questionable given the structure. So you need to first explore the left side of the police station. Well, there's not that much to explore, given that on the first floor outside of the corridors there's only 2 rooms you can visit, one of which is a safe room with a typewriter and item box. On the second floor, there's a corridor with a push-in puzzle, and by the way, you're going to encounter far less of those this time around, and also only a single room you can check, the STAR's office. There you can get a unicorn medal to use back in the main hall, so you backtrack and get your first key, which can be used only on 2 doors. One near the STAR's office and another on the way there. And only after this back and forth do you essentially open your first loop, but by that point you make almost the entirety of the West Wing except the library irrelevant. Well, in case you play as Claire, the operation room will still be relevant too. Now, this back and forth structure of the beginning may look rudimentary and boring when you just show it on a graph, but what Resident Evil 2 is really good at is setting up all these little moments to keep the pace up. Here the room is empty, but you will see a licker pass by a window. Here you actually meet it, and probably due to feeling threatened will run away to the next corridor, which is suspiciously empty. And it will stay so for now. When you get to the star's office, besides the unicorn medal, you will find a stronger weapon, which now you can use against the liquor on the first floor to quickly dispose of them. And on your way back in that suspiciously empty corridor, zombies get their grabby hands through planked windows. And of course, with a newly received spade key, you can open the room you couldn't before and unlock the second floor of the east wing. There, you'll find a sort of self-contained situation with a crashed helicopter on fire. Putting it out will allow you to get a second key, and now you can loop back to the west wing and visit the last rooms you still have to search to receive an item needed to progress back on the right side of the station. While you don't have to worry about running out of bullets, a semblance of key item management is definitely a factor in the police station. Within its confines, you actually never have to worry about having more than 4 key items at the same time, usually less, and that's more than enough for your 8 inventory slots to handle. However, to escape the police station, you do need, depending on the character, either 4 electric plugs or 3 stones, one of which is broken into halves, and those can't be used until much later, thus forcing to stash them in the item box and creating the illusion of having to manage your items without actually making the same type of decisions as in Resident Evil 1. With not a lot of choices presented at any single moment in time, the amount of friction is vastly decreased, which is antithetic to the pillars of survival horror. But you do get the same feeling as in Resident Evil 1 of going through a looping and somewhat confusing building while being overwhelmed by zombies and other foes. And to keep that appearance up, Resident Evil 2 regularly changes enemy compositions in various rooms and corridors, like let's say replacing some zombies on the second floor main hall balconies with a licker. It all keeps moving at a pretty brisk pace. Resident Evil 2, like its predecessor, has a situation where you don't get the last key of the main building until exploring another smaller area. Unlike its predecessor though, that smaller area is far shorter, more linear, and once you get back, you only have a couple rooms to open on a single wing not far from each other, not the entire building. But it still gives an impression of an expanding puzzle box because one of those rooms houses the last item you need to solve a puzzle on the 3rd floor area above the library in the west wing, so you have to make a quick trek through the building anyway. And on an emotional level, that can feel like the same thing you've been doing in Resident Evil 1. Yeah, you can only really get one special key at a time, and only in very specific circumstances might have 2 in your possession for a short while before one of them gets discarded. But you're still searching for keys and opening new rooms to explore, even though the amount you have to open is far smaller than in the first game. The police station is much more guided and far less puzzle boxy than the mansion, but you still have to go back and forth through various loops to bring items to their respective keyholes. And yeah, on the way you can kill every enemy the first chance you meet them, but the game regularly repopulates environments with new monsters, so you can still be surprised and feel like danger lurks at every corner. Resident Evil 2 might lack the essence of a survival horror, but it sure goes all out to still provide that survival horror flavor. But probably what's most interesting is how the game handles its second half after you escape the police station. The first Resident Evil game by the end becomes far more linear. I already mentioned the pragmatic reason for that. If you succeed in the resource management goal, the game eventually won't be able to provide you with spaces where you have to make interesting decisions, since you'll be able to just kill everything. And if you didn't succeed in the resource management goal, well, you're going to have enough challenges anyway. So, increasing the pace and linearity of environments to get you to the finish line just makes sense for both potential scenarios. Resident Evil 2 also eventually starts making its environment smaller and less interconnected, although you still are going to find a couple loops there and there to alleviate the issues the guardhouse had. But if resource management is never really a thing in the first place, what's the point of linearity? Set pieces. The game knows you'll have enough resources to deal with what it throws at you regardless. But now, instead of creating the feeling of overcoming the horror as a reward for resource management, it creates the same feeling through set pieces. It throws one boss at you, then another, then another, then another. You have to deal with increasingly bigger challenges, and they're all put in different contexts. From a fight happening on an elevator to a giant crocodile chasing you through the sewers. and Resident Evil 2 understands that the mechanics are not really suited for complex bosses, so keeps the principle of them being fairly simplistic while avoiding the annoyances that the big fights in Resident Evil 1 had. So what it also does is make sure every boss has a weakness, either a type of weapon they're susceptible to, or an action that you can do to kill them instantly. While you're not starved for resources, should you figure out it's best to use a certain weapon or ammo type, you once again simulate the feeling from Resident Evil 1 of being strategic, even though there you actually have to very actively preserve something for particular situations. There's one aspect that all these scenarios have in common though: variety. Even in the police station, Resident Evil 2 tries to ensure there is enough variety of situations as it guides you through the large interconnected space, but once you get out of it into even more controlled environments, it's really focused on making sure you don't get stuck on any single thing for too long. I'd even go as far as say that variety is really what makes Resident Evil 2 tick on a moment-to-moment basis. Let's be absolutely fair. Even though monsters like zombies have a wider range of behavior, like potentially crawling towards you after being brought down, the enemy design is still pretty basic for an action game, as are the mechanics. You just stand and shoot, occasionally reposition yourself. So on a moment-to-moment level, Resident Evil 2 lives by constantly changing the context of the situations you're in. And on a global level, it handles the topic of variety through character choices and A/B scenarios. The first Resident Evil game had two fully contradicting scenarios depending on whether you'd select Jill or Chris. So whose campaign is the canon one? Resident Evil 2's answer is yes. In other words, it's a mix where both Rebecca and Betty have participated in and survived the events of the game. I think that's a fine compromise. Besides, it's not like Resident Evil 2 is a game that should care about canon, since it's going to make things much more complicated, in a more interesting way. In Resident Evil 2, you have a choice between the rookie cop Leon Kennedy or Chris's sister Claire Redfield. This time, the choice doesn't really affect difficulty, while in Resident Evil 1 you could definitely say choosing Chris would be objectively more challenging than choosing Jill. Both Leon and Claire start with 8 inventory slots. Both Leon and Claire have a unique permanent item that loses its relevance after the police station. Leon has a lighter, which Claire has to find separately. Claire has a lockpick, so she doesn't need the several small keys Leon will find throughout his campaign. They have access to different weapons, but not in a way that one of them is at a disadvantage. Most important weapons for Leon are a pistol, a shotgun, and a magnum, and those can be upgraded if combined with special parts. Claire can't upgrade weapons, but her bowgun is great at dealing with hordes of zombies, while the grenade launcher is just a distinctly powerful weapon on its own. Oh, and unlike Resident Evil 1, you can change the launcher's ammo type at any moment, another very helpful quality of life feature. Other than that, in terms of gameplay, both characters are pretty much the same and have access to all the improvements the game introduces. Health is now shown visually. When it goes below the fine condition, the running animation changes, while when it's very low, the characters actually start limping. Far more comfortable indicators than constantly checking menus. Both Leon and Claire can also push away zombies faster if you mash the various buttons on the controller. This might have been a feature in Resident Evil 1 as well, but if it was, it's really hard to tell due to lack of visual feedback. Regardless, this means that globally speaking, there is not going to be that much of a difference who you play as in terms of core mechanics. What makes the character choice aspect really stand out in Resident Evil 2 is the variety in gameplay and narrative events introduced not only through who you play as, but also in which order you play the campaigns. There are essentially two templates. One is character specific. For example, only Leon works with Ada Wong, a woman who says she's searching for her boyfriend John, but there is more behind her motivations. And only Claire will have as a main focus finding and taking care of the little girl Sherry Birkin. There are more examples of course, but these are the core ones. The other template is order specific. Scenario A is the one you will be completing first, and that's the one we've been discussing in the previous segments. Its main specificity is that you will enter the police station from the front, and the final boss is a mutated William Birkin, Sherry's father. In Scenario B, you enter the police station from the back, and your final boss will be a tyrant who also pesters you regularly throughout the campaign. These two templates are then combined into 4 possible actual scenarios known as Leon A, Leon B, Claire A, and Claire B. If you complete Leon A first, you will make a save continuing which will start Claire B, and vice versa. If you want to get the absolute full narrative picture possible, you do have to complete each pair, as there are world-building details that are available only in one of them. For example, in Leon B, it might not be exactly clear why the Tyrant has a beef against him and Ada, but in Claire B, it is made clear that he is after Sherry's pendant, which has the new G-Virus sample that Sherry keeps in Claire B, but Ada happens to get in Leon B. But even if you decide to complete only one pair of scenarios, you're still going to get a cohesive, singular narrative, which is probably the most impressive part of the whole structure. Story-wise, there are no direct contradictions between the A and B scenarios of each combination. More than that, they're specifically structured in such a way that they complete each other. For example, in Claire A, when you first encounter Sherry and follow her to the lounge, you will have a meeting with Leon, asking him if he has seen a little girl anywhere nearby.
Claire, you made it!
Yeah. Have you seen a little girl around here?
Yeah, you just missed her. Who is she?
I don't know. But it's too dangerous for her to stay here alone. Leon, I'll go look for her. You go and find us a way out of here.
When you play Leon B, you will see Sherry running away and then have the same conversation with Claire.
Hey! Wait!
However, this won't happen at all if you play through Leon A, as there Leon meets Claire in the Star's office, and that's where the meeting will also happen in Claire B. The launch segment is absent. As amazing as this is though, there is a certain sense of disappointment whenever you go through a B scenario, since from a gameplay perspective, things are not as well connected. Except sometimes they are. It's conflicted, that's the problem. And it would have been absolutely fine if contradictions would concern the more minute details like ammo placements and reappearing enemies. It's a zombie outbreak, those are easily reconciled in one's mind. No, I'm talking about the big things. In the starting cutscene of the game, both Leon and Claire get separated as they have to leave the car before a truck crashes into them and explodes. In scenario A, you start on one side of the crash location and have to go through a gun shop to get to the police station. When you reach it, you'll eventually find yourself having to put out the fire from a crashed helicopter, a situation I've mentioned before. Now, in scenario B, you will start from the other side of the crash location, going through streets and environments you never saw in scenario A. This feels awesome. And then when you get to the police station rooftop, you actually see the helicopter crashing. It's unbelievable just how strong this starting sequence is for the feeling of immersion. It's also unbelievable how quickly this feeling deflates when your next objective is to put out the fire from the helicopter. Oh, that's disappointing, considering that Resident Evil 2 actively contextualizes Scenario B as what the other character was doing during Scenario A. But you'll have to redo just a lot of puzzles pretty much exactly the same way, and honestly it really wouldn't have been a problem if a bunch of them were cut. Do we really need both Sherry and Ada to push the same 3 boxes into place? In fact, some of the puzzles are cut. There are doors that are locked in Scenario A but are already unlocked in Scenario B. Some locations in Scenario B are unreachable until certain narrative triggers when the character from Scenario A opens the path.
Do you read me, Claire? We now have access to the back of the parking lot.
Got it.
I'm getting out of here and heading to the sewer. Can you meet me there?
I'm on my way.
Do you read me, Claire? We now have access to the back of the parking lot.
Got it.
I'm getting out of here and heading to the sewer. Can you meet me there?
I'm on my way.
More than that, there's a number of gameplay choices that actually transfer from one scenario to another. Only 9, and with most of those you'd be forgiven to not realize it was a choice in the first place. But there is one really meaningful instance, a special locker housing a side pack which increases inventory limit from 8 slots to 10, as well as a submachine gun, one of the few weapons in the game that uses up 2 item slots. Whatever character A takes from the locker will be unavailable for character B, and the game makes that quite clear, which leads to a very memorable choice. But there's just not enough of them amidst all the inconsistencies. And while those are disappointing, ultimately the shared narrative prevents the immersion from falling apart. More than that, the only way to see the true ending for a particular pair of campaigns is to complete both scenarios A and B. And I know, coming from Resident Evil 1, the prospect of experiencing repeatedly different variations of the game's story might feel questionable, but it's actually really good. Resident Evil 2 understands that in a game like this, what really matters is the characters. The plot may be straightforward, but as long as you care about the participants or at the very least find them interesting, it will work. In the case of our main playable cast, the game achieves that by providing them with 2 layers. A personal goal and something that deters from it which still shows their inner strength. Leon is a rookie cop and all he wants is to help people, even when they never listen to him.
Where are you going, Ada?
To the chemical plant. I have a feeling that's where I'll find John.
Ada! Wait! Hey!
Leon, are you still there? We're leaving.
Are you crazy? The streets are still crawling with zombies.
It'll be all right, trust me. We found a way to the sewer. Follow us later.
Claire! Claire! Wait! Man, why doesn't anyone ever listen to me?
What deters him is obviously the T-virus zombie outbreak ravaging Raccoon City. People keep dying on him, but he still tries to save and protect everyone he meets, even if they're not the best people to be around.
Get out of here before you lead it right to me.
Hey, I'm not going anywhere. I'm the only cop left alive in this building.
What?
Look, if you want to live, then you're gonna have to leave with me.
Claire is looking for her brother Chris from the first game, but he's nowhere to be found since he decided to fly to the main HQ of Umbrella in Europe. She could just follow him, but she's not going to leave other survivors like Sherry in danger.
Isn't this... That's okay. You keep it. I'm sure it'll keep you safe. Wait here for me, okay? I'm going back to look for your mom.
Thanks, Claire. Even though I'm an only child, neither of my parents ever spent much time with me because of their work. But now that you're with me, I finally have someone to rely upon.
Sherry...
Which leads us to the rest of the cast, where each also has 2 layers to their personalities. Once again, a personal goal, but also a secret. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're actively withholding something, just an element underneath the surface. So if you take Sherry Birkin for example, she's a little girl that just wants to find her parents who happen to be working for Umbrella. But it turns out her parents are the ones responsible for the new G-virus in the first place. William Birkin, in turn, wants to prevent Umbrella HQ from stealing his work. And he's so adamant about it that not only him resisting is what caused the T-virus to spread around the population through rats, but he's also willing to inject himself with the G-virus to stop Umbrella transforming himself into a grotesque monster. A monster that his wife Annette is all too willing to protect. Her secret is that she cares about the G-virus more than she does about her daughter, to the point that she has hidden a sample in Sherry's pendant, unwittingly making anyone having that pendant a target for the tyrant Umbrella has sent to retrieve it. But there are other parties involved too. Ada Wong is searching for her boyfriend John, a premise that's based on such a random puzzle from the first Resident Evil that unless you already know who Ada is, there is no reason to doubt her story. But in fact, she was sent by another organization to also retrieve the G-virus. You can see how another overarching layer appears. Everyone seems to be somehow connected to the G-virus one way or another. Even the police chief Irons, who is... well, let's just say he's incredibly messed up. What makes him really fascinating is that he's at the core of the entire environment setup in the game, something that Resident Evil 1 didn't have in its original release. It was just general entities responsible. But in Resident Evil 2, the entire convoluted setup of the police station is being attributed to Chief Irons. His workers already found it weird that he keeps ordering and placing various art objects all over the station, but what he's really doing is hiding the pathway to Birkin's secret research facilities for which he's taking bribes. More than just being a corrupt official though, he's a lunatic. Being the primary suspect in 2 cases of rape during his younger years while avoiding conviction, it doesn't become much of a surprise that after everything went to shit in Raccoon City, not only he's willing to hunt down any last survivors, but also he is particularly interested in re-engaging with his taxidermy hobby.
Just look at her. She was a true beauty. Her skin nothing short of perfection.
Yeah, I don't think we want to know for which purposes exactly. The outline of Resident Evil's 2 plot is exceptionally simple. Pretty much every resident is a zombie and you need to try and escape the city while on the way destroying whatever's responsible for the outbreak to make sure it doesn't spread. That's it, and that's what happens regardless of which order you complete the scenarios in. But the characters actually add quite a lot of depth to that very simple outline, creating some really memorable and dramatic experiences, particularly when you're summing up everything that's going on in Leon's and Claire's campaigns. I do have to say that in terms of overall drama, the combination Claire A and Leon B works much better. Whoever goes through scenario A has more interactions with William Birkin's various mutated forms. And while the tyrant hunting for Sherry in Claire B is also suspenseful, making the focus of the story William trying to inject the virus into Sherry and then creating a vaccine for her is more compelling from a thematic perspective, considering the family ties. And in scenario B, whoever has to fight the tyrant in his final form gets assistance from Ada after she faked her death. She throws in a rocket launcher for the main characters to use. If you play as Claire, she obviously doesn't know who it is.
Here, use this!
Who are you?
But should you play as Leon in the B scenario, it once again becomes more compelling.
Here, use this!
Ada, is that you? Ada!
And don't get me wrong, there is actual engaging drama in the other pair of campaigns as well. For example, only in Claire B will Sherry have a final conversation with the mortally wounded Annette.
Mom! Mom!
Sherry, you have to escape. I know I've been a terrible mother, but I still love you. Forgive me.
But then in Leon B, you have to carry infected Sherry to the train while Claire is busy preparing a vaccine, making it feel like the two are actually working towards a common goal by the end. Something that's missing in the Leon A, Claire B scenario. Now, if you've watched my Resident Evil 1 review, you might have noticed that all this time I have been suspiciously silent about the aspects of actual dialogue writing and voice acting. And that's because it's actually good here. Is it without issues? No.
It's over.
No. I have to find my brother.
You're right. This is just the beginning.
Look, Ada, in contrast to her final scene with Leon A openly declaring her love in Leon B, will never not be strange.
Leon, please, escape.
No. We're a team. I can't just leave you behind.
I'm just a woman who fell in love with you. Nothing more.
Lady, you've known the guy for several hours. Subtlety works better here.
Ada! Ada! I've got you. Don't give up.
Leon, it's over. Just let
make it!
It's too late, Leon. We both know it.
No! I promised you that we would escape. You just have to help me out here.
I really wanted to escape with you, Leon. Escape from everything. Goodbye.
Ada!
And while there's a lot of dialogues that are actually well acted, Resident Evil 2 is not without its share of weird or clunky stuff.
Annette!
Where's Sherry?
But I asked her, and she's never even heard of the G-Virus before.
Which room? Tell me.
But even with these issues, this time the implementation of plot and narrative is actually in line with the gameplay aspirations that in the case of Resident Evil 2 are inspired by blockbusters. It's not something you have to laugh at to accept. It's actually something that works and makes the process of replaying every scenario combination more engaging. Though in that regard we also should discuss the questions of extras that Resident Evil 2 also doubles down on in comparison to the original title, and while we're at it, might look at some port differences. Resident Evil 2 really focuses on the aspect of challenging oneself with the help of the knowledge you have of the game. Like in the first title, there's a timer which tracks how long it takes you to complete a campaign, but now it's only a part of your overall ranking, which is also defined by how many first aid sprays you've used, herbs don't affect the scoring, and how many saves you have. Obviously, the higher the rank you're going for, the less of each element you have to do. The game also employs a different way to get bonus outfits. Now you don't just receive a key after completing it once, but actually have to reach the police station without picking up anything on the way, and this will spawn the zombie of Star's helicopter pirate Brad Vickers, and only after killing him will you get the key. Both of these aspects have something in common. You purposefully limit yourself to get a bonus you're interested in, be it a costume or a ranking. Now, while this obviously doesn't change the overall design principles of Resident Evil 2, this sort of self-imposed challenge does actually bring back some elements of resource management and tension from the first game, since you have to actively ignore certain locations or items in the name of speed and efficiency. And getting to low health when going for an A ranking run is particularly tense, since while there is some leeway in terms of how much healing or saving you can do, you still have to make a choice and use your knowledge of the game for the best pathfinding, as limited as that is in the comparison to the first game. Though you have to make absolutely no saves if you're interested in the Gatling gun. Rewarding completing a challenge with absolutely game-breaking elements is still compelling. But those aren't the only unlockables Resident Evil 2 has. First, there's the fourth survivor minigame where you play as Umbrella Agent Hunk trying to escape a massive amount of enemies with only a limited supply of weapons and ammunition. Technically, it's a short 10-15 minute scenario, but it's actually quite an interesting challenge since the enemies are many and there are no pickups along the way, so you have to make do with what you have. And if you're persistent, you unlock the Tofu Survivor, which is the same scenario but with a tofu instead of Hunk. Oh, and you will have only the Steel Shitty Knife as a weapon. Subsequent releases have introduced new extras. One of them is Extreme Battle. It's okay, I guess. Playing as Leon, Claire, Ada or Chris, you have to go through the game's areas backwards and find special bomb items in the police station. There's some degree of randomization involved on higher difficulty levels, but honestly, I found this mode more annoying than interesting. Extreme Battle is not present on the Nintendo 64 port, but what that version does have is a mode that randomizes item placement, which is the closest thing Resident Evil 2 has to advanced mode from the first game. While it can bring variety for the experienced players, I do think something like the advanced mode where item changes are more purposeful would be a more elegant alternative. The Nintendo 64 port is interesting for multiple other reasons though. I mean, first would be of course the technical one. There's been a lot of tricks used to fit all the content onto a single cartridge without cutting anything from the core campaigns. In fact, there are some extra lore files added to create new ties with Resident Evil 3, as well as the still in development back then Resident Evil 0. But what the Resident Evil 2 for Nintendo 64 also has is an additional alternative movement method based on the camera direction and not character facing. While it does make some aspects of the game like avoiding enemies easier since the zombies are not designed with such a control method in mind, it also is a living example of the problems I've mentioned in my Resident Evil 1 review this control method would entail. The need to constantly recontextualize directions, which ironically adds quite a bit of friction. You can see how practically every screen change Leon does a twirl of some sort, as even I, who have played through the game multiple times before trying out this control method, still need to contend with constantly readjusting what forward means. So to be absolutely honest, I would still recommend the 10 control method for the game. While there were also releases of Resident Evil 2 on Dreamcast, PC and GameCube, any changes present are really negligible and they still provide the same core experience. So let's rank it all with my Stasocritic scoring system. Stasocritic is divided into 5 different categories of various weights, each is scored from 0 to 10 based on specific criteria for each possible number. The first category is design, which has the biggest weight, that of 4, since how a game is played and structured is what defines our experience the most. And I will assign a 9. I know, some might be surprised considering how the beginning of the video has been spent explaining why Resident Evil 2 is potentially borderline not a Resident Evil game at all, but I don't rank based on adherence to complex meta topics such as brand identity. No, all scores are relative to what the game itself attempts to achieve. And while Resident Evil 2 is an action game with a survival horror flavor rather than actual horror, that doesn't mean it's a bad action game. In fact, it's very well structured, paced, with a lot of varied encounters that take into account the seemingly unfitting for an action title mechanics and don't try to create challenges for which they wouldn't be suited for. At the same time, the reason why this is not a 10 is because there actually are aspects that I haven't mentioned since they don't really matter for the game at large, but do matter for scoring. Sometimes the survival horror sensibilities do try to seep into Resident Evil 2 and they just don't fit. A good example are the lickers. These have amazing visual design and actually a pretty particular specificity. They are blind, so focus on just hearing you. That's a survival horror design. And you'd be forgiven for not realizing walking is a valid strategy, because there's barely any reason to actually try to stealth your way through when you can just kill them, even in the playthroughs where you tend to challenge yourself by going for higher ranks. Some hallways have lots of zombies, and that is sort of pointless since there's barely any thought process or repercussions in killing them all. The tyrant that hunts you in Scenario B very quickly stops feeling menacing. Again, his design feels like it should challenge your resource management skills in a survival horror game, but you don't need them to take care of him every encounter since you'll have just tons of ammo. But there's a reason I haven't mentioned these kinds of issues in my core analysis. In the context of the game, they really are negligible, even though sadly there's enough of them to prevent me from assigning a 10. Next, we have emotions, a category with a weight of 3 that's all about personal feelings. Here, I will also assign a 9. Resident Evil 2 has been a blast. Its scenario structure, where you combine all the narrative dots together in your head, creates a very special kind of experience. And playing every new campaign variation while attempting to improve your rank has been nothing less than enjoyable. The thing that's missing for a 10 is the gameplay connection between A and B scenarios. Every campaign is a great roller coaster on its own, but also not enough is done dramatically to really heighten the experience. Killing advanced lickers with a submachine gun or disabling the tyrant in several shotgun shots does only so much to one's emotional state. Again, gameplay-wise, the strength of Resident Evil 2 is variety, not mechanical depth. But I won't lie, the moment when I saw the helicopter crash for the first time when I was going through a B scenario was so amazing! And then the disappointment when I realized I need to find a valve and put out the helicopter fire, which is the exact same thing I had to do in Scenario A, was so palpable that it just left a sour taste for the entirety of the experience that honestly wouldn't have been there if Resident Evil 2 would go with a bunch of obviously contradicting scenarios without any pretense of being connected. But A and B scenarios are connected. And while the narrative connections are very cool, they're not enough to outlevel the gameplay contradictions for me. This aspect is also one that greatly influences the category of cohesion, which has a weight of 2 and is all about how well the different facets of a game are connected together to create a singular, wholesome experience. Here, I will assign an 8. For the most part, it's really just a matter of how the game positions these scenarios. And 8 is still a really good score that takes into account how well Resident Evil 2 brings its world building, environments, characters, and gameplay situations together regardless of the faults in the A-B campaign paradigm. And as we have just recently discussed, it's very strong in the contextual department, which is a category where I will assign a 9. I've already explained why the characters are very interesting, why the world-building aspects work, and how it all enhances a plot that's simple but it doesn't need to be complex in the first place. Chief Irons is a particularly harrowing villain because he doesn't have any grand plan, desire for world domination, or something ambitious like that. He's just a very sick man who managed to get away with a lot of awful acts in his life. And there's definitely something really scary about that. The reason why I don't feel comfortable assigning a 10 is the writing. Obviously, it's effective enough for memorable characterization, but also it's still clunky enough throughout a big chunk of the experience that you often sort of go, yeah, okay, I guess. Similar arguments can be applied in relation to aesthetics, a category where I will also assign a 9. I mean, you've seen the footage yourself. The pre-rendered environments are very detailed, characters have striking designs, and music is very atmospheric and effective, particularly the safe room piece, which is probably my favorite track from the game. But then, there is the acting, which is not bad. But, like the writing, sadly it also is consistently weird enough that you sort of go, yeah, okay, I guess. I suppose the irony is that when quality overall increases, flaws stand out more. Still, all this means that when the scores and their weights are taken together, Resident Evil 2 will get a final Stasocritic rating of 88. It's a really great game. The criteria of the scoring system are such that it's very difficult to get to the score of 90, so the fact that Resident Evil 2 has done that is a testament to its quality even after all this time since its release. A true classic that you won't regret trying out. All that being said, in the end I think Resident Evil 2 has failed its job as a sequel. I know many will disagree. After all, so many people call this game the perfect sequel, or what a real sequel should be. And I guess, yeah, if the point of a sequel is to muddy the water regarding what the franchise is in the first place, Resident Evil 2 has absolutely zero connection to the notion of survival horror. It says it is, it welcomes you to the world of survival horror, but that's nothing more than flavor to its admittedly unique, thanks to the mechanics involved, kind of action experience. Still, that doesn't take anything away from the quality of the game, and there's no reason not to enjoy it. And speaking of enjoyment, please do leave a like and a comment if you have enjoyed the video. Thank you all for watching.